some days when I'm really in struggle, I'm like, this is what's supposed to be happening. This is happening not to me, but for me.
This is happening not to me, but for me. This is happening not to me, but for me.
You get to decide right now, today, that life is either happening to you or life is happening for you.
This is happening not to me, but for me.
To you or life is happening for you.
This is happening not to me, but for me.
Well, what if life is happening
but you are never going to
you?
get to the next place.
We live in a vulnerable world, and one of the ways we deal with it is we numb vulnerability. We are the most in-debt, obese, addicted, medicated adult cohort in U.S. history. The problem is, and I learned this from the research, that you cannot selectively numb emotion.
And it was through the wisdom, really, of the leaders of our Juice Plus company. The Brave Leaders program is really a personal growth and leadership development experience, and it's based on the pioneering work of Dr. Brene Brown. We base our program on her latest book, Dare to Lead. I facilitate all the classes, all the experiences myself. Brene actually made that mandate as of 2020, and she certified personally 500 professionals worldwide to do this work, because she can't do it all herself. Now, this is how the program works. For 12 weeks, they're going to do an online Brene Brown course. Everyone was so thrilled about that. I loved it. You know, when they just showed her picture without even her name, and people were like going crazy, I was like, yes, this is so great, because it's reinforcing. You know, we had to pick one person to affiliate with, and I was a little nervous, you know, personally, being the one that picked the one person.
If you are not in the arena getting your ass kicked on occasion because you are being brave, I am not interested in or open to your feedback about my work. Period. Just period.
No one who has ever achieved more than you will ever judge you for watching more.
There's a really, I think, easy way to think about it. And it's this: there are millions of cheap seats in the world today, filled with people who will never once step foot in that arena. They will never once put themselves out there, but they will make it a full-time job to hurl criticism and judgment and really hateful things toward us.
Who right now has someone in this room who is actively judging them for being in this room?
And we have got to get out of the habit of catching them and dissecting and holding them close to our hearts. We gotta let them drop on the floor. Don't grab that hurtful stuff from the cheap seats and pull it close. Don't pull it anywhere near your heart.
I couldn't do a comprehensive deep dive on Brene Brown without attempting a little qualitative research of my own. Now, I'm not an expert like Brene is by any means. I am an amateur, so when I sent out surveys in preparation for this video, I didn't call it qualitative research, I called it qualitative research. It has nothing to do with koalas. I just didn't want you to think that I was an official qualitative researcher or anything, so here's a picture of a koala. But in the spirit of Brene Brown's work, for this video, I conducted interviews with a variety of people. Students, social workers, casual readers of Brene's work. I also sought out stories sent to me over email, and I ran a survey on Google Forms to learn more about everyone's impressions on all the topics that we're covering today. So this video isn't going to be just my opinions on Brene Brown. It's gonna be roughly 105 people's.
I'm Emily Carveth. I am a student in the Masters of Social Work program at Fairfield University in Connecticut. I'm graduating in May, so I'm really excited. And I'm also a student in the Veterinary Social Work Certificate program at University of Tennessee, Knoxville. That's awesome. That's my specialty within social work.
My name is Nancy. I'm a social worker. I work in, primarily gone to school and worked in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, so out on the East Coast. I have a background mostly in working with folks in residential treatment programs, mostly with adults. I've mostly done most of my work with adults with either a history of severe and persistent mental illness and or issues with substance use and addiction. So kind of had I worked in a bunch of different settings, worked in a homeless shelter before, worked in an inpatient rehab, worked in the prison system up in New Hampshire here, and now working in an outpatient setting.
My name is Maya. I use they, them pronouns, and right now I'm a student. I'm getting ready to go into physician assistant school. But before that, pre-pandemic, I'm a musician. I play the viola primarily, but I'm also a composer. And I have really been into the kind of community building culture, specifically like the Black queer community, and getting our stories out there.
I'm Beth. A couple years ago, everyone was talking about Brene Brown, and then I read 2 of her books, and I was like, I don't know. She came off as very privileged.
Today, we're going to do a deep dive on Brene Brown. I've never seen anyone do a deep dive video about her on YouTube before, which is interesting and also makes me a little scared because she does seem to be so universally loved that my criticism might earn me some backlash. But then I remember, hey, I was the first person to publicly criticize Rachel Hollis on YouTube back in 2018. And we saw how that turned out, so let's go for it. And by the way, this video isn't going to be entirely critical. Like my opinions about most people, my opinions on Brene Brown are very, very mixed. This is going to be a long one, so grab some coffee while we dive deep into today's research question. Is Brene Brown a self-help hero, a girl boss scammer, or something in between?
Hit you some nuts!
There was lots of memes.
Makes me wonder if I should pick up lesbianism.
Chicago. You guys asked for it.
What's up, my fellow small business supporters? I'm Savy. Welcome back to my channel, Savy Writes Books, where we talk about books and business. Today's video is going to be a book review of not 1, but 3 books, and also a deep dive into a big business coach type figure, so we're getting a little bit of it all today. If you're new here, please don't forget to subscribe, because every Friday morning at 11 a.m. Central Time, I put out new videos, and don't forget to check out my second channel, Your Morning Guru, where we stream every morning now at 7 a.m. Central, 8 a.m. Eastern. We did an entire week about Brene Brown on that channel, and we have a lot more fun and in-depth weeks coming for you guys. If you like this mug, check out 90s Kids merch linked in the description below, as well as my novel, 90s Kids. So on to the topic. Who is Brene Brown? Brene Brown is a researcher, author, and all-around self-help guru. However, unlike most gurus, Brene actually has the credentials to back it up. In 2002, she received her PhD in social work from the University of Houston, where she now teaches in addition to her work as a visiting professor at the University of Texas, Austin. Back in 2011, she had a TED Talk on the power of vulnerability go viral, launching her to fame. She now has a second TED Talk as well as a recent Netflix special. And she has 6 best-selling self-help books about learning how to be vulnerable and connect with other human beings on the basis of empathy. She's also called me a sociopath 3 times. But before we unpack all of that, y'all, I need some protein to get through today's monster of a video. Oh look, it's today's sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by Magic Spoon, a high-protein, low-carb brand of fun breakfast cereals with a variety of tasty flavors. Magic Spoon cereals have been with me throughout my entire process of getting back into working out during my surgery recovery. I'm now back at the gym with my trainer once a week, plus working out at home again, and it's been super important to me to get extra protein into my meals every day. So starting the day off with a high-protein breakfast feels amazing and gets me on the right track every day. Magic Spoon cereals have 0 grams of sugar, 13 to 14 grams of protein, and only 4 net grams of carbs per serving. They also have about 140 calories per serving and are keto-friendly, gluten-free, grain-free, soy-free, and low-carb. You can build your very own variety box and choose from Magic Spoon's best-selling cocoa, fruity, frosted, peanut butter, cookies and cream, maple waffle, blueberry, and cinnamon, plus the newly reformulated honey nut flavor that will now be added to the Magic Spoon permanent collection. Lately, I've been loving eating the fruity flavor, and since Magic Spoon recently sent me a box of the new honey nut flavor, I'm really starting to enjoy that one as well. It's delicious, guys. So click the link below to get some Magic Spoon cereal. You can build your very own variety box and use my code SAVVY for $5 off. And since Magic Spoon is now adding honey nut to their permanent collection, make sure to add that to your custom box and try it out as well. Magic Spoon is so confident in their product that it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee. So if you don't like it for any reason at all, they'll refund you your money, no questions asked. And also for my Canadian and British viewers, don't forget, Magic Spoon is also now shipping to Canada and to the UK. So click the link below and use the code SAVVY for $5 off, or go to magicspoon.com/savvy to save $5 on your order today. Thank you again to Magic Spoon for sponsoring this video. Now onto my thoughts on Brene Brown. Much like Brene does, we'll start with a story. Throughout my childhood, I didn't understand that other people felt shame. Not because I thought it was just me, but it isn't, like the title of Brene Brown's popular 2007 self-help book would suggest. I didn't know other people felt shame because I myself didn't really feel shame. Now, I do feel a wide range of emotions. I feel guilt, regret, joy, fear, anger, love, but the unique mixes of feelings that come with shame and that come with embarrassment, I don't really feel those. And I've talked to a lot of people this might be. It could be due to neurodivergence. In 2015, I was diagnosed with OCD and I've taken medication ever since. Also, I went through therapy around this time. And when I talk about my experiences with OCD, many of my audience members have pointed out that my experiences often sound like their experiences with autism, which makes sense considering over the past few years, a lot of research has come out about the similar qualities and traits that OCD and autism often share. When I've discussed these topics on Your Morning Guru, some of my members of my chat have told me that I'm the first person they've ever seen articulate exactly how they were feeling. This feeling of neurodivergence, but without a feeling of shame. Meanwhile, others said the exact opposite, that their OCD, their ADHD, their autism, or any other neurodivergence they might had only increased their shame because of hypersensitivity to social environments, leading to social anxiety. So I've never really been a socially anxious person. Many social cues I don't really pick up on, leading me to often take things very literally. I communicate best in words. That's probably why I became a writer. And when I've complained about Brene Brown's words on my community tab or on my Discord, a lot of people have pointed out that it's possible I'm just taking her a little too literally. And that's the thing, isn't it? A lot of neurodivergent people interpret words literally, myself included. And it's strange to me that Brene Brown, someone who's well known for her work in mental health circles, didn't consider that. We'll dive into some examples of that in just a moment, but I want to share one quote from her 2011 TED Talk that told me that I needed to make this video. In 2011, Brene Brown gave a TED Talk called The Power of Vulnerability, in which she said the following.
The things I can tell you about it, it's universal. We all have it. The only people who don't experience shame have no capacity for human empathy or connection.
That's right. Now, more than a decade ago, Brene Brown told her audience and the over 17 million people who watch that TED Talk on YouTube that people like me can't experience empathy? And not only that we can't experience empathy, which is actually a symptom of another recognized mental health condition called antisocial personality disorder, which I don't have, Brene, but also that we're incapable of connecting with other humans. Brene Brown, in her talk about the power of vulnerability, about developing high levels of shame resistance and embracing our true selves, told me that my true self was unlovable. In her book, Dare to Lead, Brene Brown said the following: "Shame is universal and one of the most primitive human emotions that we experience. The only people who don't experience shame lack the capacity for empathy and human connection. Here's your choice. Fess up to experiencing shame,
or admit that you're a sociopath."
Quick note, this is the only time shame seems like a good option. So that's the second time that Brene called me a sociopath for not being able to experience the unique mix of emotions that constitutes shame. She also did it again in Atlas of the Heart. But then again, maybe I'm taking her too literally. And even if I am, what is a professional communicator but their ability to convey a message to their audience? In watching that TED Talk, I was the audience, and that's what I understood. It's also possible that maybe I do feel shame, but I'm incapable of recognizing it. Brene gives the following definition of shame in pretty much all of her books. The intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. She separates shame from guilt by saying that guilt means I recognize that I did something bad, and shame means I did something bad and therefore I am bad. So the latter of the two, I don't ever really feel. Brene, the only time I've ever felt unworthy of love is when you told me to my face that I wasn't capable of human connection because I don't feel shame. Was she trying to like physically induce shame in me or something? It's entirely possible though that I'm taking Brene's definition of shame too literally. Maybe it's more expansive than that. So in the books of hers that I read, I looked to some of the stories and examples to see if I could relate to the shame that anyone else was feeling. And I couldn't. In fact, from my very literal of the world, a lot of the stories in these books made very little sense to me since I wasn't able to pick up on a lot of the implied social cues that were required for an understanding of the story that made sense. But then again, just because Brene's work doesn't resonate with me personally doesn't mean that it's bad or that it's wrong. Just because the things she says go directly against my personal experience doesn't mean that others haven't had those very experiences that she's talking about. Maybe her work just isn't for me. So I decided to dig a little deeper. I got so many comments from people who loved Brene Brown, who said her work changed their life or inspired their careers. I got other comments from saying that they thought Brene was just yet another #girlboss business guru promoting capitalist ideals, ignoring the bigger picture of systemic injustice in favor of promoting the narrative of pulling yourself up by your stylish boss babe bootstraps. So who is she? Well, as I Am Savvy writes books, let's start with the place that I can speak to the best. Brene Brown's books themselves. Let's dive into part 1 of this video, the book reviews. I read 3 of Brene Brown's books in preparation for this video. I thought it was just me, but it isn't, Dare to Lead, and Atlas of the Heart. Completely by chance, I ended up reading these books in the order that they were published. So I was able to see the trajectory of how Brene's writing improved and how her research developed over time. Let's dive into each one. Review 1, I Thought It Was Just Me, But It Isn't. Thought It Was Just Me, But It Isn't by Brene Brown was published in 2007. The most concise review I can give is that this book made me feel like I was being strawmanned. The 4 hours I spent listening to this on double speed on Audible felt like a constant string of statements where someone kept trying to tell me how I felt and kept getting it wrong. Savvy, you feel shame about not having kids yet when you're almost 30. No, actually, I'm not really sure that I'm ever planning to even. But society shames you for it, and it hurts. I mean, no, I'm pretty content. Savvy, you have body dysmorphia. I did have body dysmorphia before I had my breast reduction surgery, you're absolutely right. And the media caused it. Isn't it so sad how the images of all these perfect women on TV have caused you to hate your own body? Oh, but that's not what happened though. I hated my own body because I didn't feel at home in it. It was dysmorphia, not insecurity. Isn't it awful how thin models made you feel like you weren't good enough? But they didn't though. I respect their right to look how they want for their own career as long as they respect my journey of bulking and bodybuilding and powerlifting. Body dysmorphia stems from shame. No, actually, I very rarely feel shame to the point of it basically being a foreign emotion to me. My body dysmorphia stemmed from fear. When I looked in the mirror, I couldn't tell what I looked like. All I knew was I objectively had boobs that were way too big for my body and caused me a lot of pain. I also grew up with a variety of physical disabilities and learned early on I couldn't fully trust my body. So I also stopped being able to trust my own perception of it either. Hence the fear. All humans have in life is our perception, and when we can't trust what our own 5 senses are telling us, that's terrifying. It makes you feel like you're losing your sense of sanity in real time. I didn't feel shame about my body. I felt fear that I was incapable of perceiving it with my own eyes. It's like the panic you get when you take too many drugs and you can't trust whether or not you're hallucinating. It's not shame, Brene, it's terror. Well, like you just mentioned, using drugs, it's shame that drives those unhealthy behaviors. Your excess drinking, your occasional smoking, getting high, people do these things as a social lubricant. So when we feel socially anxious or shameful, we give in to these unhealthy behaviors. Okay, but I like drinking because bourbon is tasty, I like trying out craft beers, I like going to different breweries in Chicago, so there's never been any real social lubricant aspect to this for me. I wasn't drunk for the first time until I was 19, and before that, I was an extrovert who regularly socialized, regularly really went to parties. I just didn't like drinking much yet, and also I'm Polish, so it kind of takes us a lot to get drunk. But I enjoy being drunk just because it's a fun feeling physically. That's it. I like the taste of cigarettes. I've never been addicted to that, but I just like the smell and the taste of tobacco. I just think it's good. Oh, and I also only really like weed because it makes the colors in the 90s Nickelodeon shows pop more. Well then, Savvy, if you're so enlightened, why are you reading a self-help book? Well, I still have problems, but a lot of them are operating on a grander scale than something like personal shame can address. For me, mental illness has always been a struggle. I've also often had the opposite problem of what your book discusses. For example, you talk about the importance of being open and being vulnerable and honest. My problem is that I had to learn how to stop being so vulnerable and honest because it was making other people upset. You wouldn't have liked me in college, Brene. Is that some shame I see peeking through? I guess it's more guilt for any issues I ever caused other people and regret for any issues I ever caused myself, but my problem was being too shameless. If I become any more shame resistant than I am, Brene, trust me, you wouldn't like it. Unpack that. Okay, well I think your friend over there's pretty hot. Excuse me? You give me your number? Absolutely not! Okay, well I figured I'd take a chance. Gotta be vulnerable in life. That's about the only inhibition I have left. The self-control not to tell every single person exactly what I'm thinking. I have enough empathy not to allow myself to make others uncomfortable. That's what you need to understand, is that not everyone is born with a working filter. It's actually harder not to say every thought that pops into my head than it is to say them. It seems like you're operating from the perspective that most women are passive and afraid to speak up and afraid to share their true emotions. But it never even occurs to me not to speak up until I'm reprimanded for it and have to learn to control what comes out of my mouth along with the maturity of becoming an adult. I was vulnerable enough to risk rejection by asking for your hot friend's number, but I wasn't empathetic to how that would make you and her feel as a friend and as a woman. And for that I must apologize. 911, I'd like to report a shameless woman. I'd also like to apologize if any of that skit misrepresented Brene's words or her intentions or the spirit of what she was saying in any way. I tried to convey what I thought she was saying in the book, but I may have gotten something wrong, which is really a perfect illustration of how I felt while I was reading the book. All jokes aside, I gave the book 3 stars. Here's what I agreed with. One of the main themes of I Thought It Was Just Me is the same as the main theme in a lot of Brene's work, that showing vulnerability is a strength, not a weakness. And I actually agree with this point a lot. I'm a very emotionally expressive person. I cry in front of people, I'm upfront about it when I'm angry, and I shout and squeal when I'm excited. I've always considered this to be a strength, not a weakness. Even as a child, I was always super confused when people thought crying in public showed weakness. In my brain, what I figured was, if you're comfortable enough to show your emotions in front of others, that's a sign of strength. You're showing that you have no fear of social repercussions whatsoever, which is the biggest act of dominance that a human can show. And I don't mean that I reframed it in my mind to see it that way. I thought that was the obvious conclusion everyone came to. But Brene showed me that apparently a lot of people see showing emotions as a sign of weakness. And I'm glad that I don't have that problem. I'm glad to learn that I have a healthy relationship with my emotions, and I'm glad that Brene is spreading this message far and wide to readers. And most of all, I'm glad to know more about how other people with different brains and different perspectives process the world. That's probably the biggest value I got. When I first started it and I first started spamming my community tab on YouTube to talk about how this book made no sense to me, a lot of people pointed out that neurodivergence might play a part in that. And when I realized that I was viewing this book only through my own perception, I realized that maybe if I could try reading it from the perspective of someone who would resonate with these stories, maybe I could better understand how others saw the world. Which, as Brene Brown says, is how we develop empathy. So even if it wasn't a really roundabout way, this book did actually kind of work. So while I personally experienced shame rarely to never, learning what caused the emotion of shame in other people was really valuable, especially as I'm trying to better learn how to control my own filter and take others' feelings into account about everything. That said, a lot of the stories in this book were completely unrelatable to me, which was both a strength and a weakness of the book itself. So let's take this story for example. Brene tells the story of a woman that she interviewed. I can't remember her name, but I think it's Julie, and I think they were all fake names anyway, so for the sake of this video, we're gonna call her Julie. Julie was at a party with a bunch of her friends. All the women at the party were hanging out in the kitchen, and all the men at the party were hanging out outside and playing games. So she left the kitchen to go see her husband, and then when she came back into the kitchen where all of her friends were hanging out, her friends hadn't noticed she came in yet, and she heard them all just shit-talking her. They didn't know she was there yet, and they're talking about their true feelings about Julie, all the negative things, and she could hear everything they had to say. From this experience, Julie felt an intense feeling of shame. She left the party sadly, and then the next day talked to one of her friends about it on the phone. Her friends then apologized to her, and they all agreed no longer to talk about each other behind each other's backs anymore. Apparently, this story makes sense to most people. I had so many questions, I could barely comprehend this story. Let's talk about it. So first question, why were the women and the men hanging out separately at a party for adults? Is this a thing that straight people do? Straight people in the comments below, let me know if if you do this, and why? What is the purpose of that? I've had like almost no straight friends in my life, so straight people shit just doesn't compute for me. Next thing, as I listened to the story, I tried to put myself in Julie's shoes and I tried to understand what was going on as I listened to the audiobook. I imagined myself entering a room full of friends and hearing them shit-talking me as they were unaware that I was there to hear them. I think in that situation, I would feel a couple different emotions at the same time. I think the first thing I would do would be to just stop in my tracks and listen and not make them aware that I'm there, because otherwise they'd stop. This is a golden opportunity, you guys. How often do you get to hear exactly what other people are thinking about you? That is awesome. So I would take that all in. I'd seize this opportunity. And then second, I'd probably feel some kind of rush emotionally, which I imagine would be a combination of fear, sadness, and excitement. Fear and sadness because obviously it hurts to hear your friends saying bad things about you. That's awful. But also excitement because I just get this really excited rush whenever I'm being talked about. Like, if I had to rank it, being talked about positively is obviously number 1, being talked about negatively is number 2, and then not being talked about at all is like all the way at the bottom. I guess it makes a lot of sense why I'm on YouTube if being the center of attention, no matter the circumstances, gives me that much of a high. I've just always interpreted any kind of attention as a net positive, and I get really excited knowing people are thinking about me even when I'm not around, even if what they're saying or thinking about me is negative. Obviously, I'd prefer it would be positive, who wouldn't? But as the Rolling Stones said, can't always get what you want. Like Julie, I probably would also talk to my friends about the situation, but I would never ask them to stop talking about me behind my back. What kind of solution is that? Now we can't vent to our friends anymore? We have to hide our feelings? We have to overthink every single human interaction? What happened to being vulnerable? I'd honestly be insulted that my friends think that they have to like walk on eggshells around me and not able to share their true feelings. So on the negative side, I couldn't at all relate to what the people in this interaction felt. But on the positive side, I learned that it's important to keep in mind how others in this situation might feel. Maybe I should be careful what I say in front of other people. Not everyone loves being the center of attention at any cost the same way that I do. I never want to cause a friend of mine to feel shame, and so it made me stop and reflect on how my own biases and my own personal experiences were coloring my approach to honesty versus tact in a situation. From this story, Brene Brown concludes that the reason that people gossip is because they are craving connection to one another to overcome their own feelings of shame and isolation. My question is, why can't I as a hobby? My hobbies include getting too drunk, promiscuity, getting high in front of the TV, and being a bitch. They're not numbing agents, they're not character flaws, they're hobbies. It doesn't have to be that deep. So another piece to this story, which also plays out in many stories in the book, includes a discussion of gender roles that I personally don't fully understand. And I get that gender roles exist, and I know that people often have different expectations and views of men and of women. I call that sexism, but some people just call that the way things are. And this is a similar problem that I had when I was reading Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, a few years ago, which is that I realized maybe due to neurodivergence, or maybe due to being queer, or maybe due to something else entirely, I don't often pick up on the social pressures that many people claim women are naturally socialized to feel. So in Lean In, one of those examples is that women often feel more passive or more shy when sharing their accomplishments because women are socialized not to brag. When I reviewed this book, I was like, when? Where? What? I've always shared my accomplishments, and yeah, I've been called bossy, I've been called arrogant, I've been called too full of myself, but I never realized and never picked up on the fact that that ever had anything to do with being female. I always assumed people just said the exact same thing to guys too. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, maybe there is some kind of sexist implication here that just never registered in my brain in the first place, but I continue to enjoy sharing my accomplishments, so people would be like, Savy, you're a bossy, arrogant piece of shit, and I'd be like, yeah, I know, thanks, I appreciate the net positive of attention even if you're insulting me. But I never even noticed that that was something that was associated with womanhood, because that social cue was always implied rather than directly stated in words, meaning that my brain didn't pick up on it. When I reviewed the book Lean In, my comment section was filled with women who said they knew the exact pressure that Sandberg was talking about, and that I was the outlier, not the rule. So a lot of research lately has actually suggested that neurodivergence may affect an individual's ability to understand the unstated cues of gender roles. Some say this could be a possible explanation for why neurodivergent people are statistically more likely to identify as trans or non-binary than neurotypical people are. Although that's just one data point, that's not the rule as a whole, that's not a definite conclusion. So in listening to this book, I started to wonder, is it possible that Brene Brown's work is just too neurotypical for me. But then again, I did hear from a few neurodivergent people in my comments that agreed with Brene Brown's work and found it helpful, so I can't draw a definite conclusion there either way. All I can say is that I think neurodivergence likely plays a role in my interpretation of what's going on here, and probably in the interpretations of others that I interviewed as well. Yet neurodivergence isn't mentioned in the book at all. We'll delve a little deeper into that when we head into the qualitative research section in a bit. An issue I had with this book was how much it felt like some of the research relied on the logical fallacy post hoc ergo propter hoc, or after this therefore because of this. This is similar to the correlation causation fallacy that we've talked about before, but in this one the emphasis is on the fact that one of the correlated items happened after the other one and therefore was caused by it. So here's an example, guys. If I fucked your mom and you were born 9 months later, does that mean I'm your dad? Did I impregnate your mom? Nope. That's illogical fellatio. I promise you, I'm not the father. And why is it illogical? Because I'm completely ignoring that someone else very well may have fucked your mother too, and definitely did. But if you assume that just because I banged your mom and then you were born 9 months later, then that means I'm definitely the father, you have just engaged in this fallacy. So the problem is that this fallacy can often hide in academic works because it often really sounds like the two mentioned items may have to be causally related in some way. In this book, Brene Brown talks a lot about body image and the media. Now, does the media affect body image? Yeah, probably, but none of her examples in the book actually show any logical proof of this. So in the book, Brene mentions that in decades past, supermodels weighed a certain percentage less than the average woman, whereas when this book was published in the 2000s, supermodels weighed a greater percentage less than the average woman. The implication here was that over time, supermodels got thinner and thinner, which distorted the average woman's body image. But the facts Brene presented don't actually prove that at all. She told us that supermodels have a lower body weight in comparison to the average woman than they did in the past. She doesn't say that supermodels have a lower weight in comparison to other supermodels, nor does she ever provide any source that would imply or state this. In reality, it's not necessarily that supermodels are getting thinner, it's that the average body weight of the average American citizen has gone up in the past few decades, and there's a variety of factors for that. Supermodels have had BMIs as low as 15 since like the 1960s. Another issue here is that she's only comparing weight, meaning mass in pounds, as the only measurement. Comparing weight doesn't mean she's comparing body measurements in inches and circumference at all. Where's the average supermodel's waist and hip circumference compared to the average woman's waist and hip circumference? Has that changed? Maybe it has, but if it has, she never addresses it. She completely neglects that a potential reason that supermodels may weigh less in pounds than the average woman is that over the past few decades, the average woman has become more athletic, meaning that many women have increased in muscle mass, or at the very least, many elite women athletes have increased in muscle mass, therefore skewing the average upward, because remember, we're not talking about median here, we're talking about average, which is where you add up all the data points and then divide them by the number of data points. Women's weightlifting was only added as an Olympic sport in 2000, which is 7 years before this book was published, so maybe that inspired women to get more ripped. I don't know for sure if it did, but it's a possible explanation. Did the addition of women's sports leagues in many colleges around this period affect women's gaining of muscle and an overall increase in the average BMI? Maybe, it's possible. Women's body weights may be higher in recent years than they were in the 1960s and 70s due to women being stronger and more athletic and putting on more muscle, as well as because the weight of the average American has, in general, increased over the past 2 decades. By the way, none of these are the reason for any of this either. These are all just varied factors that Brene didn't take into account in drawing what she claimed as a definite conclusion in this book. And beyond that, in this book, she basically says, and how do I know that these media portrayals of idealized bodies is affecting women's self-image and their shame? Well, if we look at the statistics of eating disorders, we can see that over the past decades, they've been on the rise. What do you call it when you have a fallacy inside of a fallacy? Double fellatio? Phalliception? So Brene Brown has told us that eating disorders increased after the ratio of model body weight to average body weight decreased. But she never proved that it happened because of that. And not only that, but she didn't even prove that supermodels' weights actually even decreased, only that the ratio decreased. So basically, all of this has told us Nothing! And I'd also like to point out that eating disorders don't always stem from shame or the media or whatever other conspiracy theories were created by concerned 2000s parenting forum wasp moms, concerned trolling, whatever they thought. I suffered with eating disorders a lot throughout my teen and young adult years. And I explicitly didn't care about looking like famous women. Their style just wasn't really my style. It was a little weirder than that. For me, I had undiagnosed OCD. So when I saw calories on food labels, my brain fixated on numbers and started obsessively doing calculations with them against my will. As a result, it's not mentally safe for me to count calories anymore, so as I'm working on bulking and cutting cycles for weightlifting, I'm working with a dietitian to count the calories for me. This is a place where Brene completely neglects neurodivergence. Neurodivergence can absolutely affect disordered eating behaviors. My example of my brain being unable to stop from fixating on numbers, that's just one example. Again, let's look at the LGBTQ community, which Brene rarely mentions in her book, other than her one lesbian couple that she talks about a little bit, which she talks about not in relation to any of these topics at all. Being queer often gives people different relations to the gender expectations around them. In fact, eating disorders are quite common in young queer people, whether because they're trans and trying to modify their bodies themselves after not gaining access to gender-affirming services, or because they feel that their post-pubescent body is forcing a look on them that doesn't show who they truly are. My point isn't that these are all the causes of eating disorders, or even the majority, just that there has been no causal link proven between eating disorders increasing in any kind of media messaging within the text of the book itself. In my experience, the two have been completely unrelated. Actually, many people who have suffered with eating disorders report that it's a result of a lack of feeling control in their own lives and circumstances, so feeling that they can manipulate their own body gives them a false sense of feeling like they have agency in their own lives. My point is, the causes for eating are varied and complex, and don't necessarily relate to any media messaging whatsoever. Although that could potentially be a factor. Brene's presented research, though, has done nothing to actually prove that. Plus, as a longtime sufferer of body dysmorphia, I just really hate these false narratives about what causes it and what it feels like. Body dysmorphia was a mental illness for me, not an insecurity. It was never caused by shame, but by fear. And that's not to say that it might not feel different for somebody else. For somebody else, it may very well cause you shame, and it may very well feel like an insecurity. But this is what it felt like for me. Oh, and by the way, guys, my body dysmorphia, which I experienced non-stop for 2 decades, completely disappeared after I had breast reduction surgery. So in some cases, a physical solution is the right solution. And it's not for everyone. I'm not recommending that to you. I'm not a doctor, but I am saying from my personal experience, it was the right solution for me. But Brene doesn't like women who get plastic surgery, which is another major issue I have with her, but we're gonna go into that in a later section of the video because I'm trying to at least stay a little focused here. All of this is just to say that saying eating disorders have increased and supermodels' body weight is a greater percentage lower than the average woman's, that tells us absolutely nothing about shame and its relations to body image. For all we know, these could be completely unrelated facts. She hasn't done anything to prove that they are causally related in any way, hence the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. Beyond all of that, though, one of my biggest issues with this book was its heavy focus on motherhood. Now, I don't deny that motherhood very well could be a strong source of shame for many women. Parents are often pressured to compare their kids to one another and often feel competitive about who's parenting better, who's making more money to support their family, and who's balancing it all with the least stress. But I'm not a parent, guys, and I don't ever intend to be. I just think this is an overall issue with many nonfiction books targeted at women. If your target audience is mothers, just say that on the book and save child-free women the money and the disappointment. Nearly every example presented in this book included a woman who was a mother and felt a source of shame related to parenthood. In one section, Brene brings up how pregnancy can often be a source of body shame, and I thought, well, here's where she's finally going to bring up that not everyone has children, right? She said that pregnancy causes shame in 3 key areas. And I assumed this is how she was going to break this down, that the 3 areas were 1, the glorification of pregnancy shames women who struggle with infertility. 2, the ways your body changes during pregnancy can cause you to feel shame while trying to reach a culturally imposed body ideal. And 3rd, the pressure to get pregnant shames women who never have that desire and makes them feel like they're lesser women or something. But no, that's not what she did. Those weren't the 3 areas. According to Brene Brown's book itself, the 3 areas of shame in relation to pregnancy are 1, the pre-pregnancy body, which in her book she does say includes for the shame of infertility, 2nd, the pregnant body itself, and 3rd, the post-pregnancy body. She acknowledges time and time again the shame that stems from infertility, as she should, because that is a massive source of devastation for many people. But never thinks in this section to mention the way that social pressures act as if women who never feel any maternal instinct whatsoever or any desire for pregnancy are treated as if they're defective in some way. Again, this section of the book, which was supposed to connect me with other women, only served to make me feel more isolated. Throughout the book, many of the examples about women feeling shame had to do with the way that they felt shame in relation to balancing raising their kids with furthering themselves in their careers, or in their difficulty deciding whether to be a stay-at-home mom, or in the shame present when competing with other moms to look like they had it together the most. And again, I'm positive that these issues do affect many women, maybe even most women. But if you're going to spend such a large portion of the book talking about motherhood specifically, why not just say that the book's for mothers? To say that it's for all women makes me as a woman feel othered, like I'm outside the norm, like I don't belong. And maybe this feeling of not belonging should be making me feel shame. But I think the emotion I'm feeling is frustration? It's definitely something more anger adjacent. In one of the sections about pregnancy, Brene Brown brings up the topic of women who don't feel a bond to their children after giving birth. She talks about postpartum depression, which again I think is a very important topic to discuss. She specifically mentions the isolation that women will often feel when they don't feel that immediate connection to their baby that they're told that they're supposed to feel automatically. So let me get this straight, Brene. You can acknowledge that there are women who don't feel certain emotions that they're told are natural and inherent. Yet when I tell you that I don't feel shame or embarrassment at all, you tell me I'm a sociopath. God damn it, Brene! Have some empathy! The next Brene Brown book that I read was Dare to Lead, which was published in 2018. This book came out 11 years after I thought it was just me, but it isn't, and honestly, I could see a massive improvement in Brene's writing as well as the practical applications of her work. And I've got to commend her on that. I'm a big believer in letting writers improve over time, not putting so much emphasis on the debut book. My first published book was Beauty King. It wasn't that good, I'll admit it. My writing's improved a lot since then. Sculpt Yourself, which came out after that, was way better. One Final Vinyl, which came out 2 years after that, was way, way better. And now 90s Kids is in a whole different league than the rest of them. 90s Kids linked below. Check out this double-sided mug. I also made dolls of the main characters. Follow Savy Makes Dolls on TikTok. Dare to Lead is Brene Brown's book of business advice for leaders. I liked that this book felt a lot more focused than I thought it was just me, but it isn't, and it felt like it had more clear and actionable advice, rather than just stories where she drew vague conclusions that may or may not say something about society. One example that I loved in this book is where she talks about the importance of leaders being open and vulnerable with the people that they're leading, but not oversharing to the detriment of any actual productivity. She talks about this one CEO who came up to her after a conference and was like, I'm gonna be more vulnerable with my employees now. I'm gonna tell them straight up that the company's failing and I have no idea what I'm doing. And she was just like, no, that's not productive vulnerability. All you're going to do is scare them. Use that vulnerability with a mentor. With your employees, be vulnerable by sharing with them that you understand their confusion and that you yourself are struggling too. But don't share every insecurity with them or else you are making it their burden. I also thought that she had some really good management advice in this book. One of the pieces I liked was when she talked about establishing with the people that you're communicating with, what does something being done look like? So if you have an employee and you're delegating a task to them, you should both ask each other, okay, what does it look like for this task to be done? So that you both go into the project with the exact same expectations for what the end result is going to be. So basically this book was all about having clear, direct, and literal communication to each other in words, which made my neurodivergent brain very, very happy. That said, this book is great for leaders and for business owners, which I am, but other than that, I'm not sure it has a ton of value. Like how the previous book didn't resonate with me because I'm not a mother, I could see this book not resonating with someone who isn't in a leadership position. This is also the book where she literally called me a sociopath in those exact words. This was the quote, "Shame is universal and one of the most primitive emotions that we all experience. The only people who don't experience shame lack the capacity for empathy and human connection. Here's your choice. Fess up to experiencing shame or admit that you're a sociopath." I'm not a sociopath, Brene! I'm just neurodivergent. This is starting to feel ableist. And by the way, guess what I learned? Shame is a secondary emotion, meaning we don't all have to feel it instinctively. Now, I'll link my sources about this below. Guys, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychologist, I don't have a degree in any of this. I'm just going by the research that I could find online, so if somebody wants to tell me that I'm wrong about some of this, please correct me in the comments below, and please do not take any of this as psychological advice. But basically, from the research that I did about this topic, I learned that many psychologists have identified 6 to 10 basic and primary emotions for humans, which include happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, fear, surprise, anything you would have seen in the movie Inside Out. So these are emotions that we have instinctively as human beings that we feel by nature. There are also secondary emotions, which are emotions that we develop in reaction to primary emotions. So guilt, shame, embarrassment, etc., those are secondary emotions. So again, I do feel guilt, I don't feel shame, and I don't feel embarrassment, but as it turns out, not all humans have to. Again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a mental health professional, so please correct me if I got something wrong, and I'm basing this on my research. It's possible I interpreted something wrong, but what I gathered from all of this was shame is a learned emotion. So if my brain never picked up on it, and it didn't pick up on certain social cues the way that it sometimes doesn't, and didn't cause me to feel that mix of shame, then maybe I don't have to feel shame. Maybe that's okay. Brene, you had me worried that I was a sociopath this whole time. That's irresponsible. And by the way, when people talk about sociopathy, they're often talking about antisocial personality disorder, which doesn't mean that you're a cartoon movie villain. It means that, like, you have a neurological condition that causes you not to feel empathy. And yeah, some people use this to be evil, but not everyone does. So I think it's also important to end the stigma around that as well. Same way that me having OCD doesn't mean that I'm clean. In fact, I'm a fucking mess. Do you see my background? Atlas of the Heart. Atlas of the Heart, Brene Brown's most recent book, was published in 2021. I liked this book overall. The idea behind Atlas of the Heart is it talks about how we define and how we identify different emotions that we're feeling. This book also made me feel more confident that I don't feel shame. Brene broke down a bunch of emotions, a lot of which I could easily identify. When she talked about fear and anger, I could think of many times I felt scared or anxious or angry. When she talked about envy versus jealousy, I could think of times I felt envious, and I could think of times I felt jealous, and I could pick apart the differences and the nuances of how those situations were different. But I could still not relate to a single instance of feeling shame or feeling embarrassment. So when she talked about what it was like to feel guilt or to feel regret, my understandings of those emotions were in line with what she was talking about. But shame just still wasn't resonating with me. Brene also reiterates in this book that everyone is supposed to feel shame, and if you can't feel shame, then you're definitely a sociopath and have no capability to connect with other human beings. So that's cool. Thanks, Brene. If you guys would like me to read and review more of Brene Brown's books, please let me know in the comments below. But in the meantime, let's move into part 2, qualitative research. What's up, my little koalas? It's Dr. Savy, your favorite mad pseudoscientist, here with some qualitative research for you. In all seriousness, one of the biggest compliments that somebody could give to Brene Brown is to talk about the quality of her, well, qualitative research. She definitely hit a sweet spot that a lot of us needed. While the Ben Shapiros of the world were out here shouting, "Facts don't care about your feelings," Brene was showing us how facts and feelings could work together. How data points and research could clue us in to how emotions affect human beings over time. There's something incredibly valuable about being a researcher and a storyteller.
You know, I am a storyteller. I'm a qualitative researcher. I collect stories. That's what I do. And maybe stories are just data with a soul, you know, and maybe I'm just a storyteller. So I said, you know what? Why don't you just say I'm a researcher storyteller? And she went, there's no such thing.
And because Brene mixes the factual with the emotional so well, I don't want to discount her research as a whole. I just wish that more people did what she did, because her research does have some very clear missed opportunities. Brene's initial research, called Shame Resilience Theory, a grounded theory study on women and shame, was published in Families in Society, the Journal of Contemporary Social Services, in 2005. She first submitted the research to them at the end of 2003. The world was different back in 2005, and even more so back in 2003, to say the least. Mainly, words like neurodivergent and neurotypical weren't a part of our everyday vocabularies. And as a result, I haven't been able to find anywhere whether Brene included a large sample of neurodivergent women in her research. Did she interview any autistic women? Any women with ADHD or OCD? Did their perceptions of the world or their ability to pick up on implied social cues affect their ability to feel shame at all? The original journal article never tells us. In one of her books, she does break down her demographics, but only by gender, race, and age. We know she sampled a variety of people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds and different age groups, but we don't know about ability status, mental health, or neurotype. So because this was missing, I decided to conduct a little research of my own. Now, before I begin, I'd like to state up front that I'm well aware that my sample is biased because, as it turns out, my audience is overwhelmingly women, overwhelmingly LGBTQ, and overwhelmingly neurodivergent, all three of which are extreme minorities on YouTube, so that's interesting. However, due to LGBTQ people and neurodivergent people both being very underrepresented in Brene's research, I guess my amateur, not professional at all research can at least start a conversation about those demographics, if nothing else. From my survey responses, about half of my participants were between the ages of 31 to 40, about 30% ages 25 to 30, about 10% under 25, leaving about 10% of people over age 40. 79% of respondents identified as women, 70% identified as LGBTQ, and 76% identified as neurodivergent. 77% identified as introverts, 15% as both introverts and extroverts, 6% as neither, and only 2% identified as extroverts, which was very unfortunate for my own research purposes, because I really wanted to see how the cross-section between neurodivergence and extroversion affected the interpretation of Brene Brown's work, but I guess my audience is mostly introverted, so I still have to rely only on my own experience to go on for that one, but what can I say? Of the respondents, about 40% said they feel shame often, and 30% said they feel shame sometimes. Much like me, 20% said they feel shame either rarely or extremely rarely, to the point of being able to count the times they felt shame in their life on one hand, so it was at least nice to see others with a similar experience. Let's take a look at some of their stories. One participant who reported having ADHD and autism said they felt shame extremely rarely, could count the number of times in their life they felt shame on one hand, and said the following: "I feel like I don't feel emotions the way others do. While I get embarrassed, I don't really care about what others think too much." For the question of, do you think neurodivergence affects your ability to feel shame, this person said yes. To my question about how they perceive gender roles, this person responded, "I care about debunking gender roles." Another participant who identified as having ADHD, autism, and PTSD also said they felt shame extremely rarely, and to the question about gender roles answered, "I cannot perceive gender roles, I'm not capable of picking up on the social cues that indicate gender," and also, when it came to describing how neurodivergence affects their ability to feel shame, they said, "I can pretty easily ignore disapproval." However, not all neurodivergent responders answered in these ways. One participant who identified as bipolar answered that they feel shame often, but not all the time, that they don't care about gender roles at all, and said about neurodivergence and shame, "I think our brains will handle most emotions differently. I think it's completely normal not to feel shame. My brain chemistry and past happens to intensify shame." In addition, I received some emails outside of the survey which included stories about people's interpretations of Brene Brown's work. Here is one such story that this person gave me their permission to share. "I would say that I'm part of Brene Brown's target audience, mid-20s, assigned female at birth, but I also have a cardiovascular disease and have recently been diagnosed with autism. Before I got my pacemaker, I would pass out a couple times a week from my heart and brain not being able to communicate with each other. I couldn't drive, couldn't hold down a job, and was incredibly weak physically. Over the past 2 years, I was fired or let go from 7 jobs due to my disability. I know these terminations are illegal, but I don't have the resources or ability to fight back. I was and am flawed physically, and I feel intense shame about not being able to do the things I want to. My pacemaker helps overcome some of those physical hurdles, but it's not a miracle worker. I still have limits." An old therapist introduced me to Brene Brown long before I knew I was neurodivergent. I watched some TED Talks she gave me and read her book, The Gifts of Imperfection, while I was seeing this therapist. It's been a while since I read the book, but skimming through, I thought it was just me, and the gifts of imperfection bring up all kinds of complicated feelings. Brown's definition of shame in I Thought It Was Just Me, the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing we are flawed and therefore unworthy of acceptance and belonging, is incredibly relatable on its own. It's a feeling I experience often. A big part of the solution is embracing who you are and not worrying what other people think of you. Again, I have no problems with this on the surface, but she gives such a hefty definition of shame in the beginning that the examples of her own personal shame later on make it very clear that she's writing for an incredibly specific audience that I'm not a part of. Even though she markets the book to women in general, the examples in this book come off as especially shallow and trivial compared to what I and many other readers have gone through. Her heart-wrenching and personal story about the time she didn't bake cookies for her children's teacher did not make me feel better about the time my friends had to carry me down a mountain because I couldn't finish the hike. The examples from Brown's life seem to come from a white, neurotypical, able-bodied, middle-class background. Any reader that doesn't fit that background, like me, probably has a hard time relating to I Thought It Was Just Me because of this. I know Brown's whole philosophy is to embrace quirkiness and stop caring what others think for one's mental health, and I have no doubt this has helped many people toward living their best lives. In fact, one of the main ways people have described me is quirky, and that is absolutely because of my autism. In the beginning of many of my relationships, romantic or friendly, my quirkiness was a trait that I would get complimented on. But as time went on, and the quirky never went away or turned off, it would be a problem. To others, it was cute that I kept my living space clean and squeak when I'm excited. It's a problem when I remake the bed in the middle of the night because I can't sleep from the way the sheets are touching me or get stuck in a verbal loop when I'm distressed. My quirks aren't some nifty personality trait that I'm trying out for the afternoon. They're part of me, and they apply to all areas of my life. There's things I can and will do to mitigate the negative and destructive behaviors, but the quirks themselves never go away. Brown's attitude toward quirkiness as a whole seems more of the same rhetoric. Like the examples in I Thought It Was Just Me, the examples she lists in The Gifts of Imperfection come off as surface level and pretty unproblematic. For example, she talks about fighting the urge to dance with her kids in the kitchen before realizing that she doesn't need to worry about looking like a fool in front of anyone. Wanting to dance with your children is on a very different playing field from having verbal tics. It appears that The Gifts of Imperfection is better received by readers than I Thought It Was Just Me, so this might just be my opinion. My issue with Brown's work in general is that she doesn't acknowledge anything outside of a very narrow audience's very shallow issues. It's okay to write for a narrow, focused demographic, but the smaller and more focused a circle gets, eventually it shrinks until it's no longer a circle and is just a singular data point. The chances that a large number of people's most distressing moments were the same as the examples given in I Thought It Was Just Me are pretty slim. It's not just that I didn't relate to her work, a lot of her audience doesn't relate to it because of the unrelatable struggles. Most of the negative reviews on Goodreads start with, I love Brene Brown, but... Her work doesn't acknowledge the existence of issues experienced by such a wide scope of people. It includes part of her intended audience. That's a summary of my thoughts and the feelings on her work. Thank you for the opportunity to voice my opinions. I care a lot about neurodiversity and disability recognition, so I appreciate you taking the time to talk about them. And I would really like to thank that person for emailing me and for giving me permission to share their story. Additionally, I got a lot of information from multiple people when I did all of these interviews that I did with a variety of people who were interested and reached out.
I first came across Brene in my own therapy because I am a person that's lived with mental health challenges my whole life, like ever since I was a little kid. Oh my gosh, I have like a lot of different diagnoses.
Yeah.
So it's definitely interesting being a clinician with her own mental health challenges. So a couple of years ago, I did an intensive outpatient program at Yale. They're local to me. And my clinician, who's actually my social work mentor now, which is really cool, she introduced me to Brene's work. There's a CD recording of a talk that she did called The Power of Vulnerability. Because I know for me, I always thought of myself as an oversharer. Like, I've been in therapy.
That's me. I'm a big oversharer. That's the thing. People have to be like, Savy, nobody wants to hear that your pee smells like coffee because you drank too much coffee today. And I'm like, why not? It's a fun fact.
Oh my God.
I get you. I'm an oversharer too.
And I always thought that was, and I've always been pretty open with my feelings. And especially, I've been in therapy since I was 2. Like, yeah. I grew up with like an emotional language, and I always wanted to talk about my feelings and be really open. And, you know, like, we're mostly in this country not socialized to think that that's okay. You know, like free emotional expression. I think it's more of a conversation now, but it wasn't. I'm 40. So like when I was younger, that was like not a thing.
Yeah.
And Brene really spoke about the power of being vulnerable and being, you know, awkward. Like, she loves to say awkward, brave, and kind. I was like, damn, like, that's what I'm kind of trying to do that's my vibe that I'm generally going for. So
yeah, I love that.
Yeah, so it was I would listen to that CD just nonstop. Like I just, I think with Brene, for me, I felt really seen and understood as like I'm a highly emotional person.
Yeah.
Like my feelings have always been right at the surface. Like I'm a heart on your sleeve type of person. I'm a huge crier.
Yeah, me too. I'm terrible. Like my thing is that like it's way harder for me to not say and show how I feel.
Thinking about it in class tonight, I had my social justice class right before I popped on here, and it's actually my teacher for that class that had us read The Gifts of Imperfection for that class. So it was just like a cool confluence of stuff. We were talking about we talk a lot about how men are socialized in particular, and like a lot of men are not socialized in this country and in the Western world in general to feel like emotions are okay. To speak about
I've noticed that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think there's definitely like certain groups of people and certain populations that, it gets drilled into your head that no, it's not okay. I've noticed actually like among folks of like higher socioeconomic status, it's like, oh, we don't talk about our feelings. Like we're gonna keep this nice and locked up. And meanwhile, like if you live in a small town, like everybody knows what's going on anyway. So I know, like for me as a kid, I felt like my emotions were not okay. They were too big and they were too expansive to like really fit in what I thought I was supposed to be. So I think we had kind of different experiences growing up. And it's like, no one really told me that, but I sort of got that messaging from I think it was unintentional messaging, but it was there. So I think Brene's work maybe speaks to people that had my similar experience growing up, that socialization, like that unspoken message, like, you're not okay the way that you are, And I'm glad that you had a different experience than that.
Yeah, really this is one thing I noticed, especially when you talk about socioeconomic class. So I noticed that when I first went to college, so I went to a smart people college. I went to a college where people are like, oh, you go to that college. I went to one of those. And when I went to that college, a lot of people there were from very wealthy families, didn't qualify for any financial aid, all of that. I made friends with some other people who, I was from like a mixed income background. I was I was poor living with a single mom for the first half of my childhood, and then my mom got married, my dad adopted me, and we lived in upper middle class white suburbia for the other half of my childhood. So I kind of got like two vastly different experiences. Yeah, but you sure did. Kind of been shaped by that in some way. So I would be friends with some other people who were from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and we were always considered like the loud people, the obnoxious people, being in a higher socioeconomic class and being told not to share your feelings. I've never heard that, but it makes a lot of sense when you say it.
I think about it because I live in Connecticut, and the area where I live in Connecticut is very, it's like Westport, Fairfield, Greenwich, like super mega, like obscenely wealthy people.
Oh wow!
Yeah. There's actually a lot of economic diversity. Like when you take a deeper look and go to the places that are not as well known in Fairfield County, but I guess the crowd that I always grew up in was very like waspy. I had this internal feeling like I am too much for this crowd. Like I'm too.
Oh, I've had that. I had that when when I lived in. Well, that's the thing. Once I was in college and found other people, I felt like this feels right. When I was in high school around a lot of people, because that was after my childhood kind of shifted and I was with a lot of, wealthier people at that point. My mannerisms were too much. My directness was too much. My aggression was too much. And it's like, there's definitely something to that. And that's really interesting. Because I've always been a very just direct and right to your face kind of person. You can clarify this for me, because this is what I'm really fucking confused about in Brene's work, is that... Okay. So she talks about how feeling feeling and practicing empathy can help with shame resilience, because the idea is that once you are able to empathize better with other people and connect with them, you won't feel so ashamed about your own circumstances because you'll be in it with other people. Yeah, great. I completely agree. My question, though, is she also says that if you don't feel shame ever, you can't feel empathy. So she's like, empathy is the antidote to shame, but also you still had to have felt shame in the first place. So I'm like, is empathy the opposite of shame, or is it on the same side as shame? Maybe this is part of the problem. I look in the world in terms of like binary code, and Tyler's had to tell me to stop looking at the world as like if-then statements, on, off, like 1, 0, because I'll be like, but if this, then this, so how could this? And he's like, because it's human interaction, it's more subtle than that. And I'm like, no, not fair. I don't understand. But so my question is how does that work? Is shame required to feel empathy, but then empathy also lessens shame? Or how does that work?
My thought is that I personally don't think shame is required to feel empathy, and I'll back up. I'll back up a little bit in that empathy is like a real passion of mine. It happens to be something that I'm particularly good at. I've always been good at. What I didn't realize until I began my social work program is not everybody knows how to be empathetic, and that there's different kinds of empathy. So there's like cognitive empathy, which is, you know, I can in thought understand where this person has been. You know, that's a skill that a lot of people possess. And then there's more of like a felt sense empathy, where you kind of have this bodily experience of what the other person might be going through. That is not always as easy for people to access. I really had to be educated that empathy is a learned skill. Like some people just, I don't know. And I've got a whole like childhood story that I think informs my empathy. Plus being in therapy for so long, I was also heavily involved in theater when I was younger. And I feel like learning theater teaches you empathy, because you have to be able to step inside. So I just had a particular set of life circumstances that really predisposed me towards empathy, but not everybody's there, you know? Like some of my classmates really, really struggle with empathy. They can feel sympathy for another person, but empathy is harder, because it's like Brene describes it as you get down in the hole with the person instead of looking over the edge of the hole going, oh, you're in a hole.
Yeah, my therapist actually showed me that video back. This was years ago. I haven't been to therapy since 2016. But back when I went to therapy, my therapist showed, I think that was my first introduction to Brene Brown. She showed me the empathy video.
Yeah.
And it was, because I know people say like your brain keeps developing till you're 25 or so. I remember feeling my sense of empathy develop, because I noticed like over the years where I was 22, 23 years old, around that time, I started being able to understand other people's feelings a lot better. And I started noticing myself like just being able to feel that along with them better. Whereas when I was a teenager and a very young adult, I guess I was had tunnel vision more so, which I guess is to be expected. Most teenagers are selfish people. But I think that empathy is definitely, it's not something that you just pop out with. You develop it over time, definitely.
Yeah. So I don't know if that was helpful at all, but that's been helpful for me to keep that in mind, that empathy is a practice and like something that you can work on and learn. If you maybe you're not quite feeling it yet, that's okay. And in terms of the shame piece, yeah, I definitely, like, my gut instinct is that shame is not required.
There's something to be said for a lot of this book felt like neurotypical reactions based on my own experiences. So I'm just wondering, like,
I can see that.
In your experience, have you seen anything related to that? This part of me is thinking like, okay, this research was originally done in 2003 that she's basing this book on. People didn't talk about neurodivergence the way they did then. A lot of people, like if someone had autism or ADHD or a mental illness or something, people would just not take their perspective seriously and wouldn't even think to interview them in the first place, which is awful, but like that's how it was then. And so I'm wondering, like, now that people are being more accepting of neurodiversity in general, I'm wondering if is that something that people are looking into, or is that something that you think could factor in at all?
Sure. My thought is, I think we have a much better understanding of like folks on the spectrum in general. Like, we didn't know back in 2003 that there was a spectrum. I don't think.
Right.
It was a very like kind of binary classification. Like, you either have severe autism or you have Asperger's syndrome, which isn't even used as a term anymore, or you're neurotypical. And it's like, there is so much nuance to human brains. And our brains there's a concept of neuroplasticity where our brains can really change and rewire over time. I think a lot more is being done these days in terms of like brain imaging and, like fMRIs, which can give you like, like a more complete picture of the brain. I think we still have a long way though to go in terms of really understanding the full range of neuro expression. So I totally agree with you. I think saying that, like, you have to feel shame in order to feel empathy, like, really invalidates people, who maybe just are not wired that way, like, it's a totally valid human experience.
So my mom, I think, first found Brene Brown through one of her TED Talks, and my mom couldn't remember which one exactly because she has the one on shame and then the one on belonging, I think, something like that. And for her, it was the belonging piece, like the idea of like all the things we do just to feel like we belong to somebody or to something. Was very impactful for her. She's had her fair share of hardships, and she became a mother at like 19 years old, right out of high school, and that was just very challenging. And I think she also like read a few of her books, but she told me that she read all of them like one after the other, so she doesn't remember like which thing came from which book.
That's
which is
what
fair.
I did too. I just read 3 of her books in like the span of a week, so I'm like, they all kind of run together in my head now.
Yeah. I could only get my hands on Atlas of the Heart, so I've been listening to that audiobook style. I'm like 3/4 of the way through it.
I like that one so far. I'm about half to 3/4 through as well. I was hoping to finish it by today, but I didn't. But I think that's probably one of my favorites so far. I think it's good to help with like identifying the specific emotions and how they usually present themselves.
Yeah. I'm so big on emotional intelligence for myself because I can get so disconnected with my own feelings.
Now, I'm wondering, like, what your kind of opinion has been. Like, have you overall agreed with Brene Brown's conclusions or disagreed, or maybe a little bit of both? Like, what has your impression been of her work?
Yeah, I think that when she talks, like, abstractly about emotions, in Atlas of the Heart, I think it rings pretty true, and she offers her own little anecdotes, and I think it says more about herself than it's something that I can relate to. I think a lot of it also has to do with the fact that she's like a mom and she has like 2 kids. She talks about that a lot, and I'm like, I don't have kids, so
I felt that way constantly. Like, she would relate so much to the experiences of being a mom, of like the shame that other mothers place on each other. I'm like, this is a world so outside, I'm just not part of it. I have no idea what you're talking about. I've never been part of this culture, but so some of it you just can't relate to. I've been there.
But and that's the other thing, like, she does, it's when she starts to talk about like empathy and humiliation and vulnerability is where I kind of start to like be, I don't know about some of these things here. I think specifically what I kind of took issue with was she said humiliation is not an effective tool for social justice or activism, and I kind of the red flag it raised for me is like, this sounds like she's talking about cancel culture, you know, the way that,
interesting.
Yeah, it sounded like the way that people who don't know what cancel culture is talk about cancel culture. And you know, putting that aside and like actually listening to what she was saying, I could also see the flip side of how it goes both ways, where I think specifically of Lindsay Ellis and how she was just so like brought down by a mob of people online who were doing it in the name of, you know, social justice, but she is also a marginalized person. You know, she's a woman, she's a queer woman, yet she is white, and she does acknowledge that, and part of the issue, you know, that came out of that was because she was a white person speaking on, you know, Raya, even though it's just completely taken out of, you know, whatever. But so I see how humiliation is more often used towards marginalized groups in a way that works. You know, that deplatforms people, and when used against like the forces that cannot be moved or changed, it just invigorates them. And I think that's part of the like cult-like indoctrination of, like, say, the alt-right is intentionally leveraging the mobs of people against them to victimize themselves, you know, so they can say, oh, everybody hates us, you know, we're a minority, we're oppressed, you know, and I see in that way it doesn't work when you're trying to leverage humiliation against those people. But I'm just not convinced. I guess I don't know what's left then. If I remember, I think she said that instead of humiliating someone who has done something, you know, I think it comes out of insecurity when people are like grandiose or like defensive or whatever, that to appeal to their insecurities instead of embarrassing them and shaming them into retreating. But what if the insecurity is just racism, you know? Like, what if the insecurity is that they feel that white people are becoming outnumbered? Like, there's nothing you can say to someone like that to appeal to their humanity, because they
in some cases. That's one thing I would wonder too, is when she would talk about empathy in some cases, I'm like, I consider myself to be an empathetic person overall, but like, what if it's a situation that you can't empathize with because you just literally do not know how they feel? Like, for like what you said, like if someone's like doing like white nationalism, how am I supposed to empathize and be like, yeah, I've been there too? Like, no, what are you talking about? Like, in some cases, it's just not true. And it's like, I don't know if that means that, like, trying to insult that person is going to change their mind. I don't really know what the solution is, but I think that I think that a lot of the cases she gave were for much more, like, everyday interactions and not, like, I think that's kind of the overall problem that a lot of people have been getting at, is that she focuses a lot on the individual situation and not on the system that causes the situation, which I understand that that's her area of specialty, but I think there's also a lot more to the picture there, where it's like, well, that situation wouldn't have happened in the first place if we didn't have this type of situation going on, or like a situation where women shame each other for not staying home with their kids wouldn't happen if we didn't live in a world full of all this sexism in the first place. So it's like, why aren't we spending our time on that? Why are we spending, like, the individual situations we can work on for our own lives? But I think that it also, you have to look at what caused the situation.
Yeah, I think that kind of speaks to the fact that she is a white lady she's not poor. I don't know like how wealthy she is, but she's a very privileged person, so she can have a lot of these conversations in an interpersonal way where the disenfranchisement is not applicable. And she does talk a little bit about it later, about how there's a such a thing as disenfranchisement or disenfranchised grief or something like that. And she even had one of her grad students talk about how she was undocumented and how that the way she grew up made her separate from her peers, and she wasn't able to experience a lot of the milestones, and that created a sense of loss and grief. Like she lost adolescence because she was undocumented. And I take her point, like, you know, that I'm glad that she mentioned it. But I also can kind of respect that the scope of the book is not supposed to be, you know, big picture, like society stuff. It's supposed to be interpersonal. But, you know, I think that's to its detriment for the rest of us, you know. Like sure, it's probably a good book for a majority of people, but again, a vast majority of people are gonna be left wanting more.
You were talking from your own experience working as a social worker that you have not been a fan of her work. And I would love to know how you first encountered it and what caused you to feel like it wasn't really for you.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think the first time I came across Brene's writing was in graduate school. In social work school, we are just like assigned like tons and tons and tons of readings. Like there's like the regular reading for your courses, and there's all these like extra readings as if people have like more time to do any of this. I guess some people do, but more than anyone could ever read, I think, personally. But she was somebody who I feel like her work came up frequently in a lot of my classes, particularly the classes that I had in social work school that were focused on counseling and developing like relationships with people in a counseling setting, kind of those broader scope courses that were just about like counseling people of all ages, you know, ways to work with people with trauma, like those kind of foundational courses. And I saw her name referenced a lot. We had some assigned readings of her work. And so this for me was about, I would say 5 or 6 years ago when I was in graduate school. So it was primarily her older works that we were given, you know, kind of as supplemental readings. And I do remember when I first, you know, came across her, finding that, you know, she had some really, really good points and some good topics. So I remember coming across that, and I remember actually really liking a lot of, you know, kind of her theories around why women may experience shame differently, why, you know, traditionally, historically, women are conditioned to feel shame in a certain way, and how it kind of forms part of identity for some people, particularly in issues with people who've experienced childhood abuse and trauma and things like that. And sort of, I remember thinking like, you know, this is really interesting. This is an interesting perspective. It was certainly a, you know, kind of more feminist perspective. I definitely appreciated that. But it was it was quite some time ago. So unfortunately, I wish I was a little bit more, you know, like adept at recalling exactly what it was. But I do remember liking it, and then I feel like there was this kind of period of time where I didn't hear or see anything about her, and the reading and the kind of studying and research I was doing either for class or in my graduate internships. And then all of a sudden, I feel within the last couple of years, probably within the last 2 years, she suddenly became like the real hot button. Like she was just like a hot topic. You hear Brene Brown everywhere. I would hear her referenced in, you know, books, other books, podcasts, popular podcasts, social media, you know, just kind of in general discussions in counseling and therapy and self-help. There's definitely a lot of crossover between self-help and the kind of more academic, traditional counseling materials that you might have. And I think Brene was one of those people who became very accessible to people, you know, just her writing. So I first really started to, I think, kind of have a little bit of misgivings about some of her work and her perspectives, really in the context of how I saw her work being promoted with the populations that I was working with. So I think I mentioned when I wrote you that kind of long rambling email, I saw her work being sort of assigned to basically being given to populations where it was just so completely inappropriate. And I don't know if that's so much like a problem with Brene or a problem with like this is an inappropriate use of her work, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
I saw that she was somebody who was like, I worked in this rehab, for example, and a lot has since come out about that place that I worked at specifically. It's very ironic. I sent you that email like last week, I think, and within the span of a week, there's actually an article published about the founder of that program coming out with all these rape accusations.
Oh my God, that's horrible.
Yeah, I have. It's so awful. I could tell you so much about that program in particular that was really problematic and kind of leading to why I left. Even back when I worked there, I know that there were rumors, but there was also a lot of other things that were going on that were a little bit more in the forefront, really around kind of women not being respected there or the clients being manipulated in a lot of ways. And that's like a whole other thing I could go on for hours about. One of the things that I found was, Brene was somebody whose work was like, okay, you can, most things for a traditional counseling or traditional treatment you can't have because it's not that type of a program. But Brene's is something that you can talk about with the clients. And it was very fluffy. It was very kind of light. And I'm not trying to say there's anything bad about that necessarily. I mean, I'm trying to think, I don't know how to say this in the right way, but it's like I worked in that particular setting, in that rehab with women who were very traumatized, a lot of women who had experienced, sexual abuse, sex trafficking, horrible traumas, a lot of people with co-occurring mental illness. And we were kind of sanctioned. The only way you can talk to people about trauma is using work like Brene Brown's work. And then if you look at Brene Brown's work, it's really things like, it's essentially just like love yourself and like, accept your flaws and never be afraid. This is the kind of key point, I think, never be afraid to be honest and open. And that was one of the things where it sounds really good in theory. But between where I worked at that particular rehab and then later when I worked in the prison system, it was just so completely inappropriate for like what many people go through when they're in the context of treatment or they're in like a setting like a prison or they've had like really difficult lives. It's a privilege to be able to be honest and open all the time. But for some people, that's not a reality. That could get you killed. That could further expose you to more vulnerabilities that actually could put your life in danger. You know what I mean? So I think it's very it was very surface. And I just felt like it's very, a lot of her work is assuming everyone has the privilege and the ability to be open and honest and vulnerable all the time. But that's a privilege. A lot of people don't have that. You have to look at the settings of where people are in, are they somebody who's homeless on the streets? Are they somebody who, is incarcerated? Are they somebody who, has these different factors or things that have led up to their situation in the here and now? And sort of telling people like, you should just, kind of just like, there's something wrong with you if you're not living this like authentic self. It's such a buzzword. You're always hearing about that. I think it's just not taking into consideration the realities of what most people face when they come into treatment or their backgrounds about where they may be coming from, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's what I've been hearing as one of the main criticisms of her is that for a lot of people, the advice of being willing to be vulnerable, it's not that people don't want to be vulnerable, it's that it's not like a fear. I guess she might be approaching it more from the like fear of lost connections with other people, whereas some people are fearing for their physical safety if they are too vulnerable about certain things. And I think that was a kind of a blind spot in the work that I've noticed. I've read 3 of her books now, and there wasn't a lot to be said for the reasons people being like having to, be quiet about certain things or hide certain things could be due to a physically unsafe environment or something like that. So
absolutely.
Yeah, I can definitely see how in certain situations, you can't reveal your entire situation to someone because they could take advantage of that. I guess in her book, Dare to Lead, which I just finished reading recently, she does start to try to draw the distinction between appropriate vulnerability and oversharing that will make the situation worse. However, I think that the only context she really used it, because it was a book about leadership, so the only context was like if you're the boss at the company and you're talking to your employees. So really it was from that perspective of being a person who's already in a position of authority in the first place. And I think she could do a little more to explain how when you're a person who's not in a position of authority and you are kind of trapped in a position in life, how to then distinguish what is safe to to share, or what are safe ways to be vulnerable and what aren't. I think that's kind of a massive gap that I have noticed.
I absolutely agree with you. I think there's definitely a lot to be said about, just again, like how does this may be like a great concept in theory. This may be a great stance for certain people, like you said, in a position of power or with privileges or with that kind of just they're in the right time and the right place. But, when people get that message and sort of internalize, well, there's something wrong with me because I'm not there yet. And, there's something that, if I'm not doing this, if I'm not being so vulnerable or whatever, then, I'm not taking the right steps and I'll never get there. I think a lot of it too, it kind of, I think when I would bring that material to the group, particularly when I worked in the rehab, and, it was again, like it was one of the few things that we were sanctioned to teach and talk about. And, it did often raise some good discussion points. Like we would talk about, what is it that, for example, was hard for you ladies to talk about when you were in active addiction? Like, how did you hide it? If and when did you feel comfortable opening up about, I need some help? And so, that it could be like a good segue or discussion point. But what I also noticed happening too is when we talked about that idea of vulnerability and everything, and it often led to people feeling like they had to be very performative and sort of one-upping each other. And, in a pressure cooker environment like a rehab or like when I worked in the prison, there's a lot of that kind of like one-upmanship. And then people would expose a lot and open up a lot in some of these groups. And we would often say, okay, this is a confidential group, right? Like, what we stock in the group stays in the group. People would often kind of jump on that and be really super open about stuff. And then the actual process of feeling like I have to get everything all out in one shot, you shouldn't feel pressure to do that. I think one of the reasons why Brene's work was used in that particular setting where I worked at in the rehab was it was very focused on the 12 steps in that program. And Brene's work is like, again, like it's sort of like okay in the 12-step world, because a lot of the 12-step treatment modality, and that's not really treatment, but it's just kind of the culture of the 12 steps is truly having the fourth step of laying out everything that you've ever done. Basically, you do this huge inventory where you write out like every single person you've ever had a resentment against, and you write down all the different things you did in the addiction, and then you have to actually read it out loud to somebody else, at least in this setting. Or if you were doing the 12 steps out in the community, you would write this all out or talk all about this with a sponsor. And I don't know if her rhetoric is mostly around women being vulnerable or if it's just in general, but asking her like, do you have a sense of what that does to somebody with PTSD? Like PTSD is a real disease. Like there's actual changes in your brain chemistry when somebody has PTSD. And again, just taking into consideration, like, what is the impact of, necessarily being vulnerable all the time with somebody with PTSD, right? Really frightening. If they're not ready for it, if they're not in a good place, mentally, if they don't have those supports in place, being pressured to be super open about everything or whatever can really set people back and actually cause things to be a lot worse for them.
Because I believe in her book, she actually says that she went through the 12-step program when she first got sober. So I'm guessing maybe she based some of it on her own experiences.
That would make sense. Yeah, that would definitely make sense.
I don't know. She came off as very privileged and very, I don't know. Like she kept talking about all the research, but never talked about who was in the research and why she was missing certain people in that research.
I wasn't sure if I was picking up on ableism or if maybe I was being too sensitive or something when I was reading. I thought it was just me, but it isn't. But it seems like a few other people have gotten that same impression. I guess where were some of the places in whether the reading or the TED Talks or whatever that you've seen, where were some of the places that you noticed ableism in her work?
Well, a lot of it is when she talks about vulnerability, which is everything she talks about. Yeah. And basically, if you're any kind of visibly disabled, you're vulnerable. Mm-hmm. Everybody can see your one point of vulnerability. I could be walking down the street using a cane, and then somebody could see me as a target or something like that. And it's a physical vulnerability, but also then people kind of judge people who are disabled. So
it's like there's something a little that felt like it was missing there as well. But I'm interested also in your perspective on, you mentioned dealing with chronic illness, and I'm wondering how that affected where you picked up on any ableism that you noticed in the work that you'd read.
I think one of the things that she said, and when she talks about addiction and she talks about numbing, and that, you know, we use medicines to numb, there's part of, I think it was her TED Talk, the major TED Talk that everybody knows, where she like shows pills and is like, you know, addicts use these to numb, but other people use these to numb. God, I wish I would numb. You know, I was like, that's very, you know, like people with chronic pain never numb the pain. The pain is never gone, ever.
Yeah.
It's just the intensity of it. And some people take medicine so that they can get out of bed in the morning, or, you know, get off the couch, or
yeah.
you know, just do a load of laundry. That's why we take meds. It's not, we're not numbing anything. We can't. And, you know, that really, that pissed me off for some reason. It was just like, you're not realizing, you know, you're grouping people in together and making assumptions about them. She talks about the armor, and she talks about masking in Daring Greatly. And I was like, yeah, what about autistic people? What about who like mask their whole entire life because,
right,
you know, and it's really hard to unmask. You know,
well, I think that's kind of the issue with self-help in general, is that self-help as a genre likes to focus on the personal rather than the systemic. And I think that the issue is that it's like people talk about like, oh, you're masking, you don't need to mask. And it's like, well, the reason that a lot of autistic people feel the need to mask is that socially, a lot of the world still functions under neurotypical social cues and things like that. So, I mean, the answer is to educate people and get the world at large able to understand a variety of different forms of communication better, but that's a way more complex thing than what you can just do with yourself. And I think that's kind of why self-help in general is kind of a flawed genre.
Yeah, I think you're right. And with masking, especially with autistic people, they start really early.
So, what did I gather from my own haphazard qualitative research? That maybe neurodivergence is a factor in humans' capacity to feel shame? Or maybe it's not. I'm not going to give into logical fallacies, so I don't know for sure, especially not from the very narrow scope of my own research. But I did learn that there are others out there who feel similarly to me, and there are even more people out there who feel completely different than I do, but that all of our stories, regardless, deserve to be heard. And that's a major issue that I've had with Brene's work as a whole. Much of the information in her books seems to confuse curiosity with judgment, and that in many neurodivergent people's stories, curiosity is often misinterpreted as judgment. And in many cases, I've actually found Brene herself to be the judgmental one. So let's move into part 3, judgment versus curiosity. An overarching issue that I noticed in a lot of Brene's work that confused me personally was the confusion between what is judgment and what is curiosity. So here's how I personally see the difference. Curiosity is wondering why something happens. It's a drive to know more. It's to know the why, the how. It's a burning need for more information because you've encountered something outside your norm and you are fascinated by it to the point of having questions. Judgment can be similar in some ways. When exercising judgment, you've often also encountered something outside of your norm, but judgment often doesn't seek to know the how and the why. Judgment assigns moral value to this new thing. Maybe you find it cool, or you find it annoying, or you find it morally reprehensible. Judgment assigns some level of morality to something rather than seeking to know more about it without any morality assigned. So here's an example where I was confused by this in the book. I thought it was just me. Brene talks about a time when she had a really busy work week and was stressed and she had a million tasks to do, and during this time she'd also completely forgot that she was supposed to sign up to bring cookies to her daughter's class party. When she went to pick up her daughter from school, she saw her name on the sign-up sheet and she suddenly felt awful because she realized she'd forgotten to bring the cookies. She ran into her daughter's teacher in the hallway. She didn't ignore the teacher. She didn't apologize to the teacher. Here's what Brene said to the teacher. "Oh, hello, good to see you. How was the party? Hey, did my husband ever drop off those cookies? Let me see. Oh, let me just take a peek in the classroom right there. Oh, yep, looks like he did, great!" And then she left. Now, when I heard this story, I was like, What? So here's a fun fact about my OCD brain. I forget that lying is a thing that people do. As I've said, I'm very easy to manipulate, you guys. Maybe that's why I got into making videos about exposing scammers, because I believe everything everyone says at face value all the time. Guys, it's very easy to scam me. If you're a scammer and you're watching this, I've got a big target on me right now. I'm very easy to manipulate. Due to me spending all of my childhood having terrible intrusive thoughts and OCD anxiety related to lying, and Savy, you better not lie or everyone you love's gonna die, now tap the dresser an odd number of times. As a result, I don't lie to people, and I often forget that other people lie. It's just not a part of human interaction that feels natural to me. So it's like, imagine that like I took you to space and dropped you in a new culture right now, where whenever people joke around, instead of laughing after a joke, they picked up their feet and chewed on them. So that would feel weird, right? Like that would be outside your norm. So if someone told a joke, no matter how funny it was, you wouldn't naturally think to pick up your foot and chew on it if you were new to this culture, even though that's what other people did, and you wouldn't understand why they did that. So that is how foreign that lying feels to me. I don't understand how it happens. One time, like a year ago, Tyler and I were talking about our childhood, and we were talking about like, oh yeah, I was often busy every weekday as a kid, and I was saying, you know, I had this rule where my mom would tell us we had to finish all our homework before we were allowed to play any video games, so I often was really busy. And Tyler was like, yeah, my mom had that rule too, but I just lied to her and told her my homework was done before it was. And I was like, what? I am 29 years old. And until he said that, I had never even considered that that was an option. Like, it wasn't that I was actively choosing to be honest because I felt like a morally better person. The concept of lying, the very idea of it just did not cross my mind in the first place. If I were in a video game, that would not be on my menu option. It is just not a natural part of human interaction to me. So I always forget that people lie. So when Brene told the story, my initial thought was, wait, why did you do that? How did your brain arrive at that conclusion? But then Brene explained that when she told one of her friends about it and her friend asked her, why would you do that? I wouldn't do that. She said that made her feel judged, and that her friend's response therefore wasn't empathetic. And then I wondered, is this another neurodivergent thing? Because to me, that's not judgment. Judgment is if you are like, why did you do that? And I am asking you why you did it because I find your action morally reprehensible and consider myself to be ethically superior to you because I did not do that. But to me, asking the question, why did you do that, indicates curiosity, not judgment. I'm legitimately intrigued about the thought processes that lead people to lying just because it's never been a part of how I communicate. So I thought, why did you do that? I wouldn't do that. Not as a way to judge Brene for her actions or tell her that I think they're morally wrong, but rather because I'm genuinely curious what would lead someone to taking a different string of actions than the one that I would take. But then again, maybe that means I need to learn to phrase things in a less judgmental sounding way, or maybe I just need to keep my fucking mouth shut more often. While Brene condemns judgment as an indicator of lacking empathy, she often seems unaware of when she herself is being judgmental. Two examples I saw jumping out at me, so let's get into those. Plastic surgery.
We perfect. If there's anyone who wants their life to look like this, it would be me. But it doesn't work, because what we do is we take fat from our butts and put it in our cheeks. Which just, I hope in 100 years people will look back and go, wow. You know? And we perfect, most dangerously, our children.
I just about flew off the handle in rage at this one. The idea that plastic surgery stems from shame makes my fucking blood boil. Plastic surgery saved my life, Brene. For those of you who don't know, 2 months ago I had breast reduction surgery. Yes, it was medically necessary because I have scoliosis, and in the before pictures you can see my breasts were each the size of my head, and so it put so much strain on my body. But even if we neglect the necessity for my back, even if I had no back problems, I still would have needed this surgery. So this is something that I don't talk about often, and maybe I'll do a whole future video about this if people are interested. But before I got my reduction surgery, I was not actually confident that I was supposed to be a woman. I spent 4 years in a questioning phase about being trans or being non-binary because my body felt really foreign to me. It didn't feel like my body was mine. And combine that with the fact that I'm attracted to other women, that I'm part of the LGBT community, and that the majority of people whose bodies I've been jealous of as someone who likes weightlifting have been male bodies, and the fact that books like this and all other self-help books targeted at women never seem to resonate with me or make any sense to me or have any stories that I personally can relate to, it just started to feel like I didn't have any connection at all to being a woman. However, once I got out of surgery, I suddenly felt right. I suddenly became comfortable with being perceived as feminine. I felt like my body was mine. It's a hard feeling to explain to someone who has never felt body dysphoria and then subsequent euphoria, but it's hell to be living in a body that you feel like is not yours. And side note, in case there's any TERFs in the chat, the fact that I was wrong about being trans, which I might make a whole video on in the future if you're interested, does not mean it's okay to tell other people that they're wrong about it. Trust people. If anything, this surgery made me even more confident that trans people need access to the physical services that they need, because it's not right to ever force someone to live in a body that doesn't feel like home to them. Now I know what it's like to feel like my body is mine. I know that everyone deserves to feel this way. It is a human right. But Brene doesn't seem to care about any of this. All she does is make fun of plastic surgery and talk about how she hopes that one day we can look back on it and laugh. No, I don't want to look back on this and laugh. I hope there isn't anything to look back on. I hope in our future plastic surgery is accessible to everyone who needs it and is covered by a universal health care for people who need it for physical or for mental health reasons or for both. At least Rachel Hollis promoted getting a boob job if you wanted one. I never thought Brene Brown, whom I'm 90% sure Rachel Hollis plagiarized most of her work from, would actually make me like Rachel Hollis more. Brene, since you're always going on about how social stigmas can shame women, have you ever considered that your contribution to the stigma surrounding plastic surgery could be discouraging women from doing what's best for them? Have you ever considered that maybe you're the one causing the shame? Porn! One thing I picked up over the course of Brene's books was the Generation X understanding of feminism and women's empowerment. I want to say it was second wave feminism, but I'm not 100% certain. Either way, for any of those of you out there who were worried that due to all the second wave Generation X style feminism in these books, no, Brene Brown is not a TERF. I checked her Twitter. She supports trans people and their right to transition and all of that, so she's good on that. We're good about that. However, there still is a massive issue here with this narrow scope of feminist rhetoric. There's the capitalist girl boss stuff, which we'll get into more in part 5 of this video, but there's also the sex negativity. One of the biggest issues I've seen in the feminist rhetoric of the boomers and the Generation X is how they see female sexualization as a form of oppression rather than specifying that non-consensual sexualization is oppression while consensual sexualization is autonomy. The main area where we see this conflict is within the realm of sex work and pornography. There's definitely a very important conversation to be had about non-consensual sex work, about human trafficking, and about the social pressures that force women into sexual situations that they didn't ask for. Those situations are reprehensible, and we need to do more to crack down on those instances. But those instances are completely unrelated from what I'm talking about in Brene's writing. In I Thought It Was Just Me, But It Isn't, Brene tells the story of the time she took her daughter to Blockbuster. Her daughter was a child, like probably 6 years old or so, and she grabbed a videotape off the shelf randomly and showed it to her mom and was like, "Mom, are these princesses?" And what it actually was a pornographic adult film with barely clothed women on the cover. Now, I think there's something very obvious to get angry about here. Why was the video rental store keeping the porn in a place where a child could reach and grab it? Why weren't pornographic videos kept in a separate section of the store where you had to show an ID to enter? Why weren't the covers locked behind boxes that you could only open if you proved to an employee first that you were of age? That's horrendous. And in Brene's position, I would be absolutely outraged about that. But that wasn't what Brene was upset about. She was mad that the video rental store was carrying adult films at all. She even went to speak to the manager in a typical Karen fashion, and the manager told her that the store was stocked with pornos on the corporate level and that there was nothing that this individual person could do about it. Yeah, Brene, minimum wage workers aren't responsible for this. Her conclusion was to boycott video stores until they stopped carrying any porn whatsoever. She then had a conversation with her daughter about how videos like this are degrading and objectifying to women and harmful to society overall. But that goes against all of Brene's previous messages about empathy and avoiding judgment. Yes, get mad that the porn was accessible to children in the store. Get mad about that. Protest that. Boycott for that reason. And if somehow you found out that the story carried tapes that featured women who weren't involved in that career out of their own free will, protest that. But don't get mad that the store has porn for consenting adults who want to watch it, especially if the tapes at the store only involved other consenting adults doing their jobs. Who are you to judge whether adults want to make a career out of having sex on camera? That's not your business. And it's certainly not your daughter's business. Brene's daughter's 22 now. I sure hope she wasn't set up all this time to view sex work as inherently degrading or to judge other women for their own career choices. Also, Brene, I've got to say, I'm sorry, but do I have this right? Sex work is but working at Blockbuster for minimum wage, where you get yelled at by some fake outraged Generation X feminist virtue signaling, forced to stay in that job because outside of working for big corporations, you're denied your basic human right to healthcare. That's not degrading? Forced into labor for your right to live, well, that's honest work, but going into porn because you're passionate about the craft of it, that's harmful to women. Where do you draw the line for what work degrades women and what work doesn't? And on the topic of work that degrades women, let's talk about how Brene was, unbeknownst to almost anyone, involved in one of the types of companies that destroys women's lives the most. Let's move into part 4, multi-level marketing. You guys know we can't talk about a hashtag Girlboss self-help guru without talking about the connections to multi-level marketing companies, pyramid schemes, and guru scammers. Oh, did you guys think Brene Brown was safe from this? Let's go. When we covered Brene Brown on Your Morning Guru, a former Juice Plus distributor reached out to me in the DMs. I'm not going to reveal this person's identity for legal reasons, which I'll get into in a moment, but I trust this person a lot and believe that the information she shared with me was accurate. She told me that back in 2017, when she was part of the MLM company Juice Plus, the company started a program called Brave Leaders Plus, which Brene Brown was the coach for. Here's what she said. At the time, we had to sign a document saying that we couldn't say that Brene was working with Juice Plus. I wonder if that was because she knew about MLMs and didn't want her name tied to one. I don't know, but I did it and it didn't do anything for me.
Hi, I'm Karen Jones. I'm the director of the Juice Plus Brave Leaders Plus program. So the Brave Leaders program is really a personal growth and leadership development experience, and it's based on the pioneering work of Dr. Brene Brown. But it's customized to the unique needs of your Juice Plus journey. It's the only program that's underwritten and sanctioned by the Juice Plus company. Brave Leaders Plus program started 3 years ago, and since then, a little bit about Brene Brown, quite famous in the psychological field, certainly. She's been all over the place, you know, Oprah and all these other TV shows and everything else. So we look to Brene Brown in times of difficulty, how we can do the best we can, how we can be the best we can during times of difficulty like during this pandemic. Again, we base our program on her latest book, Dare to Lead, and the program is based on all of that research.
She continued. In 2017, there was a program for some distributors who made specific bonuses or levels according to the guidelines. At that time, they worked with Brene to have us use her program. She was aware that the company would be utilizing her program for specific distributors. When they announced that, and when they invited those distributors, including myself, we basically had to sign a contract saying we would not talk about Brene's program that she was providing for the Juice Plus distributors. They said that was part of her agreement for Juice Plus to use her program. I then asked this distributor whether she knew if Brene definitely knew that her materials were being used by Juice Plus, and this person said she knew they were using it with her permission and were advertising internally that it was her program.
And what's different about the 2020 program is that I facilitate all the classes, all the experiences myself. Brene actually made that mandate as of 2020, and she certified personally 500 professionals worldwide to do this work, because she can't do it all herself. And I'm one of those people, and you see here is a picture of Brene and I after I graduated from her certification program.
I will always criticize any business coach or guru who provides coaching material to MLMs. You're keeping women in a company that actively siphons money away from their families and emotionally manipulates them. I've criticized Gary Vee and Rachel Hollis both for speaking at Beachbody conferences, but at the very least, they've both since said that they don't believe in network marketing anymore. Not that that absolves them of any of the terrible shit they did back then, since neither of them even apologized, but I still haven't even seen Brene speak out against MLMs in any way at all. And maybe that shouldn't come as a surprise, since Brene often appears on podcasts along with some of the most stereotypical business gurus of all time, including Tim Ferriss and Gwyneth Paltrow. If you don't know about Tim Ferriss, here's some background. He's the author of the book, The 4-Hour Workweek. We covered him on Your Morning Guru, and I reviewed his book in my business book tier ranking video. Basically, his advice was, exploit your workers! Find countries where the minimum wages are below $4 an hour so that you can find employees there and use them to cut your costs. Now, as I've said before, I don't believe in guilt by association, so I don't necessarily think that just because Brene Brown has gone on Tim Ferriss's show, that makes her complicit in anything he does. That doesn't make any sense at all. But what I can't wrap my head around is, if you want to be taken seriously as a fact and data-based mental health professional, why would you ever align your brand with Goop? If you're unfamiliar, Goop is Gwyneth Paltrow's brand of pseudoscience. It's Joe Rogan for girl bosses. The brand famous for the vagina candles and the jade eggs that cause infections. The brand that encouraged hanging out with psychics and taking hallucinogens in a forest. Joe Rogan for girl bosses. Which makes it even extra weird that amid Joe Rogan spreading COVID misinformation on his podcast this year, when a bunch of other creators decided to pull their work from Spotify in protest of Spotify's exclusive contract with Rogan, Brene Brown decided to put her podcast on hiatus in solidarity. So she wants to protest Joe Rogan, but is cool with aligning her brand with Gwyneth Paltrow? What performative shit is that? Brene did, however, since return to having her podcast on Spotify, which I can't blame her for, considering, I hate Jeff Bezos, but I still sell my books on Amazon because independent creators have to make money in this horrible corporate-driven world too. Which is actually a great segue to Part 5, Girlboss Capitalism. Whenever I read a nonfiction book, I find myself constantly asking, why? When Rachel Hollis said that boxed cake sucks, I asked, why? When the booktube community gets in arguments about indie versus traditional publishing and about who's allowed to tell own voices stories, I ask, why? When a self-help guru tells me yet another unrelatable story, I ask, why? Because if I can't understand the root of where it's all coming from, I struggle to fully internalize the messages, but often my string of why almost always leads me back to one place. Corporations! So let's talk about Brene Brown's books and how they reinforce Generation X boss babe capitalism that keeps corporations turning. Brene's books focus a lot on the struggle of being a mother, particularly a working mother, but also in some cases a stay-at-home mother. From the interviews in the books that I read, she talked to women who worked outside the home, women who stayed at home with their kids, etc., but I never heard her talk about a woman who was the sole breadwinner with a stay-at-home dad husband. She did talk to single mothers, but what about a woman who was the sole breadwinner with a stay-at-home husband? Where were the women who were married to the stay-at-home dads? So here's one example from the book. Brene talks about the struggle of going back to work after maternity leave, and how those struggles can lead to shame. In one section of I Thought It Was Just Me, But It Isn't, she goes into how when her daughter was an infant, she struggled with juggling a work call and changing her daughter's poop explosive diaper, and also breast milk leaking out of her shirt all at the same time. So my question was, girl, where was your husband? Why didn't he take care of the baby if you had a work call? The assumption in this story, like many others, like when I've talked about Dave Hollis's book and things like that as well, is that the husband in most cases returns to work pretty quickly after the baby's born, while the wife spends some time at home for maternity leave and slowly struggles to return back to working. And I, as someone who, previously stated, struggles to pick up on gender cues, had a little trouble understanding this at first. Every time a woman talks about the struggle of being a working mom, I'm always like, wait, how is that different than being a working dad? And aside from pregnancy, obviously, and your body having to physically recover from giving birth, because my mind doesn't always go there, because in my mind I'm also like, well, a lot of women adopt too, so like, Anyway, when I think about stories of women being stuck at home with the baby and the husband goes back to work, I'm usually like, why? And then a lot of people will say, well, because the woman has likely taken some level of maternity leave and has been granted this position to be able to return back to work slowly, and the husband isn't taking paternity leave. He has to go back to work. And so then I'm like, okay, well then why aren't husbands taking equally long paternity leave? And then I remember, most companies in the US don't offer that and barely offer guaranteed maternity leave after pregnancy either. So Brene framed this issue as one of internalized shame. She was too hard on herself for not being able to juggle it all. But I don't think this problem is internal. I don't even think this is personal. Every issue presented in this book is systemic. Brene, imagine if the US offered guaranteed maternity and paternity leave in equal amounts. You'd never have been in that situation in the first place. And I guess that's why I rarely turn inward to feel shame myself. My natural reaction is to turn outward and feel anger. As I've said before, that's not judgment, it's curiosity. I'm desperate desperately curious to know why more people turn their anger inward towards themselves instead of outward toward the circumstances that cause this. Is it because we only have so much that we can personally control in this world? Which once again feeds into this narrative of personal responsibility. Sure, we can focus on what we are personally responsible for, but that lets exploitative corporations and lazy governments off the hook for the rights that we as humans have been denied at their expense. It's just another bootstraps narrative. It's Rachel Hollis, it's Jen Sincero, it's Sheryl Sandberg, it's peak Generation X girlboss feminism. You can have it all, girl, as long as you work yourself into the ground and let male-led corporations get away with exploiting your labor. So maybe that's why I can't feel shame. Because I can't control the world that I was born into, and I'm angry about that. Any shame I might feel is overwhelmed at the anger at the people who made these circumstances happen in the first place.
Pretend that what we do doesn't have an effect on people. We do that in our personal lives. We do that corporate, whether it's a bailout, an oil spill, a recall. We pretend like what we're doing doesn't have a huge impact on other people. I would say to companies, this is not our first rodeo, people. We just need you to be authentic and real and say, we're sorry, we'll fix it. Corporate, whether it's
a bailout, an oil spill.
We just need you to be authentic and real and say,
we're sorry.
That's right. When a giant corporation does irreparable environmental damage to the earth, they just need to start apologizing. I found a really interesting discussion of all of this on the subreddit r/critical theory. Now, I don't know a lot about critical theory at all, but I did think that there were some interesting points that were brought up here. So here we are on r/critical theory with this post called Why Do I Hate Brene Brown? I'm no longer in academia, so I don't have access to journals as easily. I can't stand her and how much she is lauded. I don't know if it's her content or her presentation style, but something really bugs me. Has anyone written about her, if not her specifically, about authenticity in leadership or whatever her shtick of the day is? Maybe because she often comes across as a semi-woke version of Tony Robbins. She humanistically liberalizes systemic oppressions as opportunities for individual and often spiritual enlightenment. For her, it's all about the personal journey of building individual resilience under a growth for its own sake mindset. She rebrands old defunct social theories under new names and then gets celebrated for it in popular media. So I think most academics and theorists would find that pretty insulting and scam-like. She also comes from a lot of privilege and money, and it shows in her proposed solutions to social ills. People often send me her stuff because I spend a lot of energy hiding my disability. I have a cardio-neurological autoimmune illness. I hide my illness not because I'm ashamed of it. I hide it because no one will fucking hire me if they know I passed out just standing in line at the grocery store and that I will probably have a stroke soon. Not all of us have the privilege to be honest and vulnerable. I'm not considered disabled enough to get disability payments, so I gotta pass as able-bodied to literally survive. Brene Brown advocates honestly without considering some of us lie to survive. That's a good point. That's like what I was bringing up, right? Often what she's categorizing as shame is often mischaracterized fear or anger. So in my case, right, I was talking about anger and how anger is often the thing I feel instead of shame. In this case, and in a lot of cases, it's not that you're feeling shame about your disability or feeling shame about your body or whatever, but that you're feeling fear that somebody won't hire you. This isn't an issue that an individual can solve on their own. I can't really find anything in the literature, so I'm just going to talk out of my ass for a bit. I wonder if you hate Brene Brown because being authentic and vulnerable is a privilege a lot of us don't have. In almost every job I've had, being authentic and vulnerable would get me labeled as an oversharer, a complainer, not a team player. What's up? For most of us, don't tell your boss anything they could use against you is a better rule than be open about things you're ashamed of, even though I agree in principle that the world would be a better place if we were more vulnerable. A lot of self-help writers tend to look at problems as individual problems rather than structural problems because if they didn't, they wouldn't be self-help writers. Completely agree that this is kind of the problem with the self-help industry as a whole. In my opinion, her work encourages people to learn to love the struggle of capitalism. She suggests people come to terms with themselves as failures rather than interrogate systematic failures. To me, it comes across as very tone-deaf and appears to be aimed at assuaging the guilt and shame of the upper class, justifying a kinder, gentler exploitation as self-realization. What did I say? Generation X girl boss capitalism. Man, I'm glad I found this thread. I am a social worker and not a Brene fan. Some nuggets might allow for conversations, but the whole of her commercial ability and presentation just screams self-help money driver. I don't know, it all feels disingenuous to me. I always feel a little icky and do not understand the mega love. It's easily digestible, which makes it marketable and profitable. I like the mention of attempted wokeness. It's like corporate training tools for companies to give the impression to employees that they care deeper and are in tune with emotional understanding. It also just feels like white lady let's all share and care Pollyanna shit. Now we're going to take a look at this article by Dr. Carrie Yazid called The Dangers of Courage Culture and Why Brene Brown Isn't for Black Folk. The other day, there was an interesting thread on Twitter with Dr. Jen M. Jackson, a columnist at Teen Vogue, regarding her initial encounter with the writings of Brene Brown and her thoughts on how the author encourages white supremacy by telling white women to be courageous and vulnerable. She stated, having courage to finish that swim meet or ask for that big raise isn't like having the courage to be black in a country that wants us dead. She went on to say that the cost of courage for a black person in America is high because we were trying to find the courage to speak out against racism, the courage to protest the killings of innocent black people, and the courage to fight for equality in a country that literally hates our existence. By the way, I will link this source in the description below. And then let's take a look at this article as well, which I'll also link below. The Cliché of Brene Brown, an Unpopular Perspective. I tried to like Brene Brown's work. I watched her TED Talks, YouTubed my way through many interviews, and read 2 of her well-received books. Sounds like me. But I don't understand her popularity. I don't see anything novel or unique. Not a word I've read or heard is anything new or earth-shattering, yet her quotes are everywhere and people cling to them like a 2-year-old to a mother's hymn. This isn't to criticize Brown herself. She seems like a down-to-earth, kind-hearted person. It's about her messages that are quoted all over the internet, in magazine articles, in books, even out of Oprah's own mouth, as if they are gospel, innovative revelations. For me, anyway, there's nothing remotely new about them. I think we've lost some of our souls to some of these thought leaders. We are looking for gurus when self-understanding is already within ourselves, just waiting for us to reach in and pull it out. So I think all of these articles and Reddit threads and stuff kind of come at these things from different perspectives. Is it that Brene Brown's work is kind of tired and just rehashing some of the same old stuff? That's kind of how I felt when reading it. Is it that the work kind of ignores systemic disadvantages in favor of talking about shame as something that is personal rather than something that is caused by external factors? I think that's it as well. I think there's definitely a lot to discuss, hence why this video is so fucking long. In her books, Brene talks a lot about replacing shame with guilt. By this, she means that instead of feeling like we're personal failures for everything that goes wrong, instead, we can regret our mistakes and apologize and try to make amends. And I agree with this, but I think it goes beyond that. I think in some cases, we need to replace shame not with guilt, but with anger. Are you feeling shame about the fact that you're struggling to support your family on one income? Maybe that should lead to anger that your company isn't paying a living wage. Are you feeling shame that you as a woman haven't gotten promoted after giving birth? Turn that into anger about hiring discrimination. Are you feeling shame that you can't struggle working from home while nursing a newborn? Be angry that your husband's company didn't grant him longer paternity leave to be home with your baby with you, or that your company didn't allow for greater time for you to take off of work while physically healing. The way I see it, focusing on shame is just another way to excuse corporations for the problems that they caused. And Brene's focus on internal feelings rather than external systems is what makes me wonder if maybe this is all just girl boss bullshit in a new package. As Tyler likes to say, same shit, different butt. Part 6. Conclusion. If you've spent any amount of time at all on this channel, you know that my feelings being mixed on any topic is to be expected. And this is probably one of the greatest cases thus far. I have incredibly mixed feelings on Brene Brown. I will say though, what I think she has going for her in a positive direction is that above all else, she seems honest. I can't read her mind, but from what I have seen of her, I get the impression that she genuinely cares about the work that she does, and that she does want to make a positive impact on women and their mental health. I don't think she's a grifter like most of the gurus we cover. I do think she genuinely believes in her work and does want to help people, but I can't understand why she'd team up with MLMs then, or why she'd call me a sociopath so many times. Maybe I am a sociopath, but I feel empathy, so I don't think that's true. Basically, Brene made me even more confused about myself than I ever have been before, but in some ways that might be a good thing. I'm a believer in always asking more questions and always staying curious. So I do want to thank everyone who participated in this video, everyone who emailed me, everyone who did a call with me for an interview, everyone who filled out my survey. I am incredibly grateful for your help. Thank you again to my sponsor, Magic Spoon, and to my Patreon supporters. I will see you guys all again on Monday on Your Morning Guru and on Friday on this channel. In the meantime, keep on supporting small businesses. Have a great Friday.
Hit you some nuts.
There was lots of memes.
Makes me wonder if I should pick up lesbianism.
Chicago. You guys asked for it.